bottom-up work to rebuild communities, to rebuild local media, to rebuild local conversations, because that's where I think there's still the most hope.
It was during President Obama's 8 years in the White House that the American public began learning and saying the names Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and Michael Brown. Young black men killed by police, or in Trayvon Martin's case, by a neighborhood watch volunteer when Martin was 17 years old.
When Trayvon Martin was first shot, I said that this could have been my son. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago.
President Obama was both praised and criticized for that statement, one of several reminders for the first black American president that how and when he discussed race was something he and his advisors had to think carefully about. In his book, he writes that early on in his presidential campaign, his advisors warned him about being boxed in as, quote, the black candidate. Looking back, as president, did you tell the story of race in America enough, do you think?
Yeah, well, look, I tried. I think I told a lot of stories. You take a look at the speeches I gave in Selma and the speech I gave during the campaign about Reverend Wright and that whole episode. And, each and every time I tried to describe why it is that we are still not fully reconciled with our history. But the fact is that it is a hard thing to hear. It's hard for the majority in this country of white Americans to recognize that, look, you can be proud of this country and its traditions and its history and our forefathers, and yet it is also true that this terrible stuff happened, and that the vestiges of that linger and continue. And the truth is that when I tried to tell that story, oftentimes my political opponents would deliberately not only block out that story, but try to exploit it for their own political gain. I tell the story in the book about the situation where Skip Gates, a Harvard professor who's trying to get into his own house, gets arrested, and I'm asked about it. I don't know, not having been there and not seeing all the facts, what role race played in that, but I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home. And not only did that cause a firestorm, as you will recall, you were already in the press at that time, but subsequent polling showed that my support among white voters dropped more precipitously after that. That should have been a minor, trivial incident than anything else during my presidency.
That's extraordinary.
Well, and it gives a sense of the degree to which these things are still, they're deep in us, and sometimes unconscious. But I also think that there are certain right-wing media venues, for example, that monetize and capitalize on stoking the fear and resentment of a white population that is witnessing a changing America and seeing demographic changes, and do everything they can to give people a sense that their way of life is threatened and that people are trying to take advantage of them. And we're seeing it right now, right? Where you would think, with all the public policy debates that are taking place right now, that the Republican Party would be engaged in a significant debate about how are we going to deal with the economy and what are we going to do about climate change? What are we going to do about, lo and behold, the single most important issue to them apparently right now is critical race theory. Who knew that was the threat to our republic? But those debates are powerful because they get at what story do we tell about ourselves?
Are you prepared to take the oath, Senator?
I am.
The president, who campaigned on hope and change, sees the continued potential for that change in the next generation, which includes his own daughters. They came to the White House as children, but Sasha Obama is 19 years old now and a student at the University of Michigan. Malia is 22 and is at Harvard. And while his daughters still keep a low public profile, Mr. Obama says they took part in the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. I'm wondering if, just as a parent, you were worried about them doing so, and as somebody who's had daughters who were taking part in that, what do you make of those who are now saying the Black Lives Matter protesters are equating them with the people who attacked the Capitol?
Well, my daughters are so much wiser, more sophisticated, and gifted than I was at their age that I always worry about their physical safety. That's just the nature of fatherhood. You will discover it when Wyatt stops just being immobilized in your house and can start wandering around and
I'm not going to allow that.
Driving cars and flying on planes. You're terrified all the time. But in terms of them having a good sense of what's right and wrong and their part and role to play in making the country better, I don't worry about that. They have both a clear sense of that I see in this generation that what you and I might have tolerated as, yeah, that's sort of how things are. Their attitude is, why? Let's change it. And that's among not just my daughters, but it's among their white friends, right? There's this sense of, well, of course it's not acceptable for a criminal justice system to be tainted by racism. Of course you can't discriminate against somebody because of their sexual orientation, right? There are things they take for granted that I want them to take for granted. But what I find interesting is they're also starting to be very strategic, about how to engage the system and change it. They're not just interested in making noise; they're interested in what works. And at least in conversations with my daughter, I think that a lot of the dangers of cancel culture and we're just going to be condemning people all the time, at least among my daughters, that they'll acknowledge that sometimes among their peer group or in college campuses, you'll see folks going overboard. But they have a pretty good sense of look, we don't expect everybody to be perfect. We don't expect everybody to be politically correct all the time, but we are going to call out institutions or individuals if they are being cruel, if they're discriminating against people. We do want to raise awareness. A great source of my optimism. When people talk about how do I think about my legacy? Part of it is the kids who were raised during the 8 years that I was president. There are a bunch of basic assumptions they make about what the country can and should be that I think are still sticking. They still believe it, and they're willing to work for it.
And while the Black Lives Matter movement has brought national attention to the issue of police reform, these young men in the BAM program say they feel a dual threat every time they go outside. There's fear and distrust of the police and fear of gun violence on the streets.
Here in Chicago this year, let's face it, has been an increase in violence. When we met last time, obviously on the south side, west sides of Chicago, some of the surrounding suburbs, there had been gun violence for a while, gang activity for a while. We've seen an uptick in it, and then we've also had to process the fact that the relationship between police and community is not what we want it to be. And so often, young black men, experience police not as a positive force to protect, but as somebody who is going to see you as a suspect or somebody to be feared. How's that played out for you guys, both while you're still in school, but also now that you're working?
Police in Chicago. For a while, I was driving Lyft. While I was still in college, I'd come home weekends, drive Lyft.
Mm-hmm.
And I was getting pulled over like crazy. Almost every night, I was getting pulled over. But the first question they asked, and I asked, "How you doing, officer? How is it going?" Their first question, need drugs or weapons in the car. Granted, I'm a big black guy, with locks, and, first thing they see, I'm just suspicious. But as I was telling the guys, I got to make it home to my family. I can't be another case where some officer have his knee on my neck, choking me out. So my biggest thing is making it back home regardless. Anything that's going on outside, I love my family, love my baby more. And that's a feeling that you're going to feel, Mr. Cooper. Like, get home, even when your eyes feel like they're like about to pop out. You get home to your baby, and that joy and that feeling that you get from that baby, it's amazing. It gives you a little spark of energy.